just your really working here at the Presidio and you're volunteering your time. I mean, it's really fantastic. The Presidio is just one of the best places in the world, and I'll always love coming here. So what I want to do just in the next few minutes is just talk a little bit about California Indians and begin, first of all, by talking about a few of the basic definitions. So you've probably heard that California Indians are hunter-gatherers, and in the anthropological literature you'll hear anthropologists talking about it as complex hunter-gatherers. So what that means is that the native peoples here, except for just a small area down in the southern deserts and Colorado River, did not practice agriculture per se, but were involved in gathering wild plants and hunting game, and actually had a very sophisticated economy, as I'll talk a little bit later about. But when I'm talking about hunter-gatherers, that's what I'm talking about. And what I want to emphasize from the outset is that California is just a fabulous place to work. And if you study hunter-gatherers, there's no better place in the world than here. And one of the things that I really love about California and looking at the native peoples is the diversity of native peoples. And today, of course, we think of California as being a very diverse place in terms of the ethnic makeup and languages. But it's interesting that prehistoric or pre-contact California was also very, very diverse. And there's few places in the world where we can, that is anthropologists, archaeologists, can study hunter-gatherers using archaeology, ethnography, ethnohistorical documents from the Spanish, the Russian, the Mexican period, and their own oral traditions, because many of the tribal peoples are very much alive and well, and we work very closely with them. If I can have the first slide here, Miriam. We're also blessed that there was some really great ethnography done on California Indians beginning in 1901 with Alfred Kroeber and UC Berkeley. And this provides a wealth of information for us to work with. And these are some of the slides, Miriam, if I can have the next one, that Kroeber and his students at Berkeley in the teens, the 20s, the 30s accumulated. And much of this is over at the university. And Bancroft Library, the Phoebe Hearst Museum, these are all materials that are archived there. Miriam, if we can have the next one. And this just shows you some of the hunting and gathering that was still going on, and to this day is still going on here in California. Now, there's no better place, as I mentioned, to study hunter-gatherers, and particularly complex or affluent hunter-gatherers, as I'll talk about. But before I do, I want to talk about what really characterizes California and what really makes the native people different than other areas of North America. First of all, linguistic diversity. If you look at the languages spoken, Miriam, if I can have the next slide there, this is one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world. I believe only New Zealand has more languages spoken in an area the size of California. And in fact, it's estimated about anywhere from 80 to 100 separate languages are spoken. And 20% of the 500 languages, native indigenous languages spoken in North America, were spoken here in California. And this slide gives you an idea. This is based on Kroeber's work and a number of linguists who did work back again in the last century, working out the different languages. And one thing I always like to do is if I'm having problems in terms of students who, you want them to maybe drop a course because they're bothering you, all you gotta do is just talk about, basically, you're gonna memorize every language that's on it, And if you need to get the size of the class down, this is a way to do it. But, so linguistic diversity, that's one of the hallmarks. So again, when people are talking to you and they say, well, what's interesting about California Indians? The first one is just the linguistic diversity. The second, Miriam, if I can have the slide, is population. The numbers of people living here in California. It's interesting that California had the highest population density of any area north of the high civilizations of Mexico. So when you look across North America and you look at all the different native peoples, California had the densest population, the most people per 100 square kilometers. And Kroeber again, this is based on some of his work, the darker the area, the denser the population. And you can see the West Coast is very, very dense. And if I can have the next slide, Miriam. And when you look at, and these are estimates that Kroger worked out, and you look at California Northwest Coast, they're working out density per 100 square kilometers. Again, look at the density difference. And what I find fascinating is, in many of these other areas, the American Southwest, the Southeast, the Midwestern part of the country, those native peoples, their economies were based on agriculture, raising corn, beans, and squash. We tend to think that that tends to really increase the numbers of people. But when you look at the hunter-gatherers out here on the West Coast in California, we've got the most people. Oh, thank you. Is there a little something special on this? Well, thank you. Miriam, if I can have the next slide. And this is Yuba Acres, so this is a little bit later. This is Yuba Acres with the Smithsonian Institution. And again, I just want to show that in terms of looking at these areas and looking at the densities of people, again, even in the latest density estimates have been done, California by far has a higher population density than any of the other Native American areas, any of the areas in North America. So that's the second thing. Numbers of people. We have a huge population in the Bay Area. There is a huge population here in pre-contact time, as I'll come back and talk about in just a moment. The next really salient characteristic is the chronology. Next slide. California has had populations for many, many thousands of years. And this is a question that inevitably you're going to be asked. How long have people been in California? How long have they been in the Bay Area? So it's interesting, our earliest sites, earliest well-dated archaeological sites with good radiocarbon dates are found not actually in the Bay Area, not in San Diego, not in LA, but out on the Channel Islands, which I find fascinating. The earliest sites are out on the Channel Islands, and these are these islands that basically parallel the Santa Barbara coast and the LA, San Diego coasts. Next slide, Marian. And this just gives you an idea of where Santa Cruz Island, Santa Rosa Island, and this gives you an idea of what the spatial area was with the lower sea level back around 13,000 years. Our earliest sites date about 13,000 years ago. It's the end of the Pleistocene. So it's the end of that last ice age. And Miriam, if I can have the next couple of slides, just gives you a couple of them. Arlington Springs is the earliest site that we now have pretty well dated, that John Johnson did. And then Daisy Cave, which is out on San Miguel Island, is also another one of the earlier ones. Again, one of the things that's fascinating about the early settlement of California is that most of these sites are coastal sites, as you can see there. They're out on the islands. People had to have boats to get out there. Miriam, if we can go back a couple slides here. Back again, back again. You had to have boats to get out to the islands and back to the mainland. And going back 13,000 years, they had ocean-going boats. Possibly tamals, which are these, basically these beautifully made canoes that the Chumash made. It may have been other kinds of boats, but they were definitely ocean-going. And they were coastal. They were maritime people. They made their living. Again, they were hunter-gatherers and fishing people. They fished. They certainly hunted sea mammals. And they also gathered shellfish and a variety of different other maritime and coastal resources. There's now a whole debate about the early settlement of North America, and California is basically in the focus on this. In the old days, that is back when I was a younger student, a graduate student, not that long ago, it was believed that our earliest people that came here to North America came over the Bering Strait at the end of the Ice Age, when the sea level was lower, and they came over and they were following huge herds of large megafauna. Bison, mammoth, other game that was coming over from Asia. And it was believed that they followed the game over here. We're now finding, though, the earliest sites, and some of the earliest sites in North America, in the Americas now, are actually maritime people. That is, people who live not off big game. We find very, very few big game sites in California, but they are people who are living off the ocean. And they had boats, and they were probably coming around the North Pacific Rim from Asia. And so right now it looks like there are several different ways, at least a couple different ways people were coming to California. One was probably along the Pacific Rim and using boats. The other is possibly, again, a terrestrial, maybe through, basically through the Bering land bridge and then down into the terrestrial part of North America. So it's much more complicated now. But we do have these early dates. I think the dates will be pushed back even earlier as we continue to work, especially on the coast. And I think that, again, is a very unique part of California. Understanding how native peoples came to California, this is really the centerpiece, because this is where we're finding these early coastal sites, these maritime hunter-gatherer fishing people. So that's the third salient characteristic, about California. We've got early sites, and these were maritime, these were people with boats, and they were highly sophisticated. The fourth salient characteristic, again, if somebody asks you about California Indians, is that we have a packed landscape. And what I mean by this, Miriam, if we can go ahead here, is that when you look at the social organization of the hunter-gatherers, as I'll talk about the complex hunter-gatherer peoples here in California, Kroeber, again, based on his early ethnographic work, he defined these as tribelets, that is, as village communities. And these were the largest politically autonomous land-owning groups in native California, what he called tribelets. Sometimes they're called small nations, village communities. But they tend to be fairly small-scale political organizations, ranging in population from 100 to 500 people. In some cases, again, down to Santa Barbara. I don't think it quite goes back 13,000 years. But we do have some early pre-contact sites that are very unique. And these are the great shell mounds of the San Francisco Bay. If I can have the next slide. These are sites that began to form along the San Francisco Bay, Carquinez Bay, the Carquinez Strait, the San Pablo Bay, Suisun Bay, around 5,000 years ago. And again, the bay that we look out and we see today, the gorgeous bay, is a fairly recent phenomenon when it comes to thinking about the geological time. It was formed at the end of the last ice age, the Pleistocene, and it began forming when sea level rise took place at the end of the ice age, when the great ice masses began to melt. And this took place in the early Holocene. So around 12,000 years ago, 11,000 years, 10,000 years ago, again, Miriam will go back, back. Basically in this area here, this was all dry land here. This was essentially just essentially these riverbeds of the Sacramento and San Joaquin coming in here, and another stream bed here. And essentially what happened about 10,000 years ago is with sea level rise, it began to flood what were originally essentially these terrestrial streams, and it formed the bay. And the bay expanded in size from around 10,000 to around 6,000 years ago. Around 5,000 years ago, the bay as we see it today was beginning to take shape. Even though there's been some sea level rise, some fluctuation since the last 5,000 years. It was 5,000 years ago that we begin to see the bay as we see it today. That's where we start seeing these very large coastal sites. That's when native peoples, who were certainly in California, began to live on the shores of the bay and began to use the very rich resources, fishing, hunting birds, shellfish gathering, a whole variety of different kinds of resources. And they produced these amazing shell mounds. So how many of you have heard of the shell mounds of the San Francisco Bay? Yeah, that's good. So these are sites that ring the bay. I mean, there's more than 450 that once ringed the bay. Many of them have been destroyed. But again, through work that was done in the last century, much of it at UC Berkeley, there were excavations done on a number of these that are now basically part of the urban sprawl of of the greater San Francisco Bay Area. This is just some of the shots just to give you an idea. So these are these shell mounds, and there are actually some sites, I don't know, how are they in Crissy Field? Is there much left of the shell mounds down there?
Yeah, they're preserved,
You know,
intact.
yeah, there are sites here right in the Presidio of these shell mounds. And what they are is they're sites that are built up into a mounded, part of a mounded landscape that had tons and tons of shellfish, hence the name shell mounds, plus lots of dirt, sand, rocks, artifacts, and a variety of different kinds of features, house structures, pits, hearth, that were built into these. The other thing that's really remarkable about these shell mounds is this is where people were buried. And in some of the big shell mounds, this is the Bay Hunters Point mound that was looked at and excavated back in the 1906, 1907 by UC Berkeley. Next slide here, Marion. This is one of my favorite. This is out in San Rafael. Highway 101 goes right through this today. This is the Greenbrae Mound. This has been basically obliterated. But again, this was a site that UC Berkeley looked at. We have the artifacts, we have the notes at the campus. But this whole thing is artificial. It looks like a natural hill, but it's artificial. It's been built up over thousands of years. And that's what's neat about these mounds, is over 4,000 to 5,000 years, they're built up. They're an accumulation of people using these mounds, living on these mounds, and people being buried in these mounds. Next slide, Marion. This just gives you some of the early excavations. They used to put trenches right straight through this. Next slide here. I'll just show you a few of these. And this is one of my favorite shots. This is a little estuary that's in the San Rafael Greenbrae area. Again, this is all part of the 101 corridor, I think, today. But it gives you an idea of what it looks like. Next slide. This is the largest of the shell mounds. So in these big shell mounds, this is Emeryville, which is part of the, what is it, the shell mound? You shop out there all the time. Yeah. What is that?
IKEA.
The IKEA. You guys know IKEA there in Emeryville, that area? Anyway, IKEA, that's all part of these, and there were oftentimes multiple of these mounds. Unfortunately, by the time Kroeber and his students got out and actually did some of the work on these, a lot of these mounds were already being destroyed, and this is the early part of the last century. And one of the reasons that UC Berkeley got involved in the work is that they saw that many of these were being destroyed, and that they needed to do archaeology fairly quickly. This is the largest of them that we know of. This is the Emeryville shell mound. So again, this is all artificial. This was a dance plaza, or a dance pavilion, built on top of it, where UC Berkeley students used to go on Saturday nights, kind of a party hangout. And it was for a number of years a real landmark here on the bay. Next slide. And this is what it looked like when it was being destroyed in 1924 to put a paint factory up. The paint factory's now been turned into the mall, and so a lot of the upper, as you can see, the deposits of the great shell mound of Emeryville has been destroyed. It's estimated, based on the excavations that the UC Berkeley archaeologists did in the early years, that there were probably more than 3,000 people buried in this mound. And in addition to that, there were lots of artifacts, lots of house structures and other kinds of features that are associated with. This is really, really rich, interesting archaeology. And there's this whole question about why were they building these mounds, which I can try to answer, but I think we're trying to move through this fairly quickly. But it's the shell mounds are really fascinating, and it's I think a really critical part of the archaeology of the San Francisco Bay. And the Presidio, again, as Eric mentioned, we have some of these shell mound sites down at Crissy Field. Next slide. And this is the West Berkeley site. So this is down by Truett and White in Berkeley. Some of you guys know, you know the Truett and White. This is what remained of it in 1906 when UC Berkeley first got in there and recorded it. Next slide. This is what it looked like in the 1950s when kind of the last upper part of the mound was being destroyed as they were expanding some buildings into the area. And this is a UC Berkeley team that is clearing this area. And next slide, this just shows you what it looks like. So again, this whole thing is stratigraphic shell and ash and rocks and materials that have been accumulated. This is one of the earliest of the mounds. This one dates back about 5,000 years. And so again, long-term chronology, lots of people, lots of activities, and this is a really rich part of the archaeology of the greater San Francisco Bay Area. And then just to talk a little bit about the people who built the mounds and the people who are here today. Again, I think most of you, or many of you know, this is the home of the Ohlone, who spoke the Costanoan language, the Coast Miwok, who are up here, Patwin in the north, the Bay Miwok, but much of this area and the area that we are is Costanoan or Ohlone native people. Next slide. And there is, again, some wonderful ethnohistoric material. Again, many of you have probably seen this. This was a Russian voyage that came into the Bay Area in 1816. Horace, who was an artist and a naturalist who was part of the voyage, has some just spectacular drawings of some of the native peoples of the San Francisco Bay Area. And a lot of this we draw on, and you can draw on if you need to give a talk about the California Indians in the Bay Area. Next slide. This is what I'm talking about, a packed landscape. So this is work that Randy Milliken, who was one of our PhDs at Cal. In fact, he was the first student who I actually signed a PhD on at UC Berkeley. I was just a member of his committee. But Milliken did a lot of the ethnohistorical work. He went back and looked at the Spanish mission records. And he was able to identify, using the Franciscan mission population density, but not huge aggregates of people. Lots of people spread across the landscape. This is San Francisco Bay, really exemplifies that, as you can see there. And this is based, again, off of Milliken's work. So again, as we move into the Spanish period, when the Spanish come in, about 1769, basically, the Spanish explorers noted, a number of these villages, and that essentially that the area was very densely packed. And most of these territories, Mary, if I can go back to that, are about 8 to 12 miles across. And again, based on Milliken's work and thinking about the number of tribelets that are in this area, he estimated there are about 58, close to 60 tribelets in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. If each one had 200 people, just this gives you an idea of the population, because again, people are going to ask you, how many people lived here? So at the time that the Spanish came in here, it's estimated that if we had 200 people in each one of these tribelets, that would have been around 11,600, or close to 12,000 people. If there were 400 people, which maybe is a little on the high side, there would have been over 30,000 people in the Bay Area. So this is, again, all pre-contact, right when the Spanish were coming in here. So again, it gives you an idea, it kind of illustrates, because we think of, large numbers of people. Typically, we think of agrarian societies that are growing crops. And of course, we think of those large numbers of people more of a historic phenomenon. But here in California, you had large numbers of people and who were living here, and the Bay Area in particular was a really great place for coastal hunter-gatherers. Yeah, question at all? Okay. Now, basically, just to end the talk here and see if there's any questions, I mentioned that we, as anthropologists and archaeologists, define California native peoples as complex hunter-gatherers. Complex, you'll see this in the literature. And what this means is, of course, this high population density that we're looking at and the profusion of these small political entities, these tribelets, as Kroger called them, were all supported by hunting and gathering of wild foods and raw materials. But these complex hunter-gatherers have particular characteristics that make them different from other hunter-gatherers. First of all, if I can have the next slide, Miriam, is they had food storage. They had granaries. They had places where they would permanently store foods. So that when there was a bad winter, when there was a poor period of being able to hunt and gather, they had food that was stored for them. The other aspect is they tended to be relatively sedentary. Although they did move around within these relatively small territories, typically they would move from one winter village into maybe some other areas, depending upon the season and the kinds of activities, the kinds of foods they were going after. But they tended to have like a central village, and that appears to be pretty common. They also had, and I don't really have the time to get into it, but a very sophisticated material culture with craft specialization, shell bead production, some really, really beautiful material that was made and still is made by California Indians. Another aspect of these complex hunter-gatherers is an elaborate ritual and political organization. And although there's quite a bit of variation, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's clear that these political organizations had a hierarchical structure to them, and that they were staffed by political leaders and retainers. And you had high-ranking and low-ranking families. People were not all treated the same. This is something the Spanish, the Russians, and others talk about. They were specially trained people. Some of them were the chiefs, some of them were religious specialists, some of them were craft specialists who made particular kinds of goods for the broader group. They were differentiated by dress, how they dressed, how people spoke to them, how they were addressed, and even what they ate varied. So there was a status difference within these small communities. And again, this is a part of these complex hunter-gatherers. Another aspect of the complex hunter-gatherers in California, and Mary, if I can have the next slide, is these were not just people who just simply lived off the land. Oftentimes when we think of hunter-gatherers, we think of people who are just kind of out seasonally and they're looking for what's available, and you know, the acorns are going to be available, and maybe they're going after some grass seeds another season, and they're doing some hunting. It appears that California Indians, in fact, were basically involved in landscape management. So even though they were not agrarian, you know, they're not your farmers who have crops that they're going out and tending every day. They were managing, they were modifying, domesticating the broader landscape. And basically, there's a whole new perspective about California Indians that I find really exciting, that we're now viewing many of these California native peoples as nurturing land managers who really constructed, as I mentioned, domesticated landscapes through deliberate human intervention. And it appears that this was going on for centuries. And it's believed that native peoples created and maintained various kinds of productive habitats, ways that they would enhance the diversity and productivity of the plants and animals that they lived off of. They lived off for food, for raw materials, for dance regalia, etc. And there were various management practices that appear to have been employed. They did some pruning of some of the trees and bushes that they were gathering resources from. They would occasionally broadcast seeds. They would move plants to new areas. They would clear areas in order to enhance the productivity of small growth in terms of plants that are growing. But the key appears to have been fire. And it looks like native peoples were very, very skilled at burning the landscape and producing a series of different ecosystems that had different successions. And through this fire and some of these other management practices, we believe they were developing an anthropogenic landscape. And that they were essentially creating a variety of different kinds of niches. So for example, we've been doing some work down at Ano Nuevo. So you know where Ano Nuevo, that's where the elephant seals are. Great place. We've been working with state parks. We've also been out at Pinnacles National Park, which is south of San Jose. A lot of people go to climb there. And what we've been doing archaeologically and working with the local tribe, the Munson Tribal Band, is to try to see if we can actually document these landscape management practices going back through time and using a variety of different lines of evidence Some of it deals with charcoal that's recorded in wetlands that we're able to core, pollen in terms of looking at vegetation changes, looking at chronology, and particular fire scars and redwood stumps, and being able to work out the fire frequency going back through time, and then looking at the archaeology. We've been able to document that in fact there was it looks like a very sophisticated management practice going on in the Emeryville area, going back at least to 1000 AD. And it looks like they were burning small parcels and producing coastal grasslands. Coastal grasslands along the San Francisco, the central coastal area of the state, are extremely productive. There's a variety of different plants, and also deer, rabbits, and others are also attracted to them. What I find fascinating in doing the work is that these grasslands in the central coast won't exist for any length of time unless they're maintained. What happens is the natural succession is shrubland and then woodlands come in. And in fact, if you look at any of your parklands that were once agricultural or once cleared, what happens over time is in successive years, scrubland comes in and then woodlands. And a lot of these areas that used to be open and you could walk through are really difficult to this day to do. It looks like native peoples were burning these areas and burning them in small plots in order to enhance the productivity of these and have different succession rates, different plants and animals that were there, and being able to really increase the biodiversity and the productivity per area, per territory that these native peoples were living in. And this appears to have been a very sophisticated management practice. So while they're not agrarian, they're not growing corn, beans, and squash like the Hopi of the Southwest or some of the great Southeast complex chiefdoms out there. We had a very, very complicated situation here, a very complex, sophisticated one. And I think that that's the kind of thing that you as, going out and you're meeting the public and talking about it, one of the things you really want to emphasize is that oftentimes when we think of hunter-gatherers, we just think of people kind of roaming out there, I think we're going, that's not what's going on, at least down in Emeryville, and we're shifting out and doing some work now in some other areas. We're going to probably start up here in Point Reyes, besides the Presidio area, one of the most beautiful areas in the world. But we're shifting out to some other areas and beginning to look at this to see if we can look at when did these management practices begin? What kinds of resources were they really trying to enhance? And how were they doing it? And so that's a lot of the work that we're involved with right now. And that's the kind of cutting edge of, I think, anthropology and archaeology right now. So just to summarize, you're working in, I think one of the most beautiful places in the world and one of the most interesting areas in the world when it comes to native people. I mean, this place, in terms of its linguistic diversity, its population, the packing, the resource management, I mean, there are very few places on Earth that have this kind of constellation of really interesting cultural practices going on. And I think if you can get some of that across when you talk to people, I think that is really, would really be magnificent. So my time, I think, is pretty much up. They wanted me just to talk for 45 minutes here. And I can certainly answer any questions you've got. I just gave you just kind of the kind of bare bones. If you talk to some people who sat through my classes and I've gone through, oh my God, I get into stuff a little more detail, sometimes a little too much probably. But I'm happy to answer any questions you've got. Yeah?
I assume it would have taken cooperation between the tribelets that you described to do the type of land management?
It's a great question, and we're trying to figure that out of an area. You can actually control in some cases how far that fire will spread. And for example, if you have rivers, but even if you have like the tops of hills and areas like that, there are changes that will take place in terms of the fire and the fire intensity. And part of what we're trying to do is figure that out. How do they actually produce a patchwork across an area? Once you have a fire, once a fire has burned an area, If you have a small fire that's burned next to it, it won't burn, there's no fuel in there, so it won't burn. So what you can do is once you get some of these small patches, you can actually start working with that. And it appears that that's part of what's going on. But your question's a great one, because they obviously had to be working with other tribal groups. And we know from the Spanish, from the Russian and other early ethno-historical documents that, that they did get along, some of these tribal, and in some cases they were, they had a lot of, shall we say, friction. There were fights that were going on, so it really varied somewhat. Probably fires could be certainly part of that, I think, in terms of what might create some problems. So, yeah.
Yeah, you had two maps. One that showed Pomos up along the Mendocino coast, but then the other map showed another name which I can't pronounce. It's tribal. What's the difference between those two references?
Oh, good. Again, a great question. So the way we, as anthropologists, archaeologists, classify California Indians, one is language. And keep in mind, languages tend to be based on linguistic work, and there are a number of stocks, families, and individual languages that they use. And a lot of it's based on linguistic work, looking at what the languages, what's spoken, these 80, these 100 languages spoken here, how do they relate to other languages, and they put them into these stocks, that is, these broader entities. Those language groupings, like the Pomo, are not the smaller political entities in any stretch of the imagination. You have many different polities, many different political entities that would be part of one language group. And then when you look at those names that Millikan had and stuff like that, those are the names of those individual polities. So a polity, or a tribelet or a small nation, there might be, in any of these one language, like the Cassanoan language, it might have 60 of them that might be part of that. So that's where the difference is. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a great question. And it is one that, again, sometimes really, I think, throws some of us off, or whether are we talking about the language grouping, or are we actually talking about the political entity? And you need to be clear about what you're talking about, because they're not the same. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
I once went down to Mission San Jose, and very nearby there's a park, and it just says Ohlones, and supposedly 20,000 Ohlones are buried there that were slaves to the mission.
There is an active Ohlone burial ground that the Ohlone people, Andy Galvin and his family, are still using to this day. And people are buried there, including his father, who just recently passed away. They are Ohlone people, and they hail from Mission Dolores and San Jose, the Mission San Jose. I'm not sure how many people they've got buried there, but it's a good number. And when there is archaeological work that's done, and sometimes where they don't have a place to move burials, say there's a road construction or a shopping mall, and they're moving burials out of the way, which is unfortunate, and they don't have a place to put those back, sometimes they are reburied there. And as a consequence of that burial, the Ohlone burial cemetery, is an active cemetery, and there's lots of people buried, and it's continuing. And that's a little different probably than the mission burial grounds, although I think that originally was part of the mission burial ground. Yeah. Yeah.
Are these language groups mutually unintelligible?
Some of them are, yes. There are, within the different language groupings and the stocks, for example, the Ohlone groups and the Pomo groups, for example, or the Bay Miwok, those were different, very structurally, linguistically, they're very different languages. They come from very different, people from different homelands, different backgrounds. I mean, again, one of the things, thinking about that linguistic diversity of California, is that you probably have people who came from many different homelands, who migrated to California, just as what's happened in recent years with all of us, but who migrated over the last 12, 13,000, even earlier. And we've got succession migration, waves of people coming in, and many of them spoke different languages. And no, they can't understand each other.
So you're saying then that the distinctions derive much, they don't describe from some sort of geographical separation, but from something going much farther back?
Yeah, when you do it, if you're really doing a linguistic analysis and you're looking at like some of the Penutian, the Hokan, some of these basic stocks, language stocks in North America, yes, they are probably originated from somewhere else. And they are spread across the country, and in fact down into, Mexico, South America. And again, a lot of it has to do, I think, with movements, population movements. And you think of the Athabascan, who are essentially the Navajo and some of those groups, which, are thought to have come into the Southwest relatively recently, about AD 1500, 1400, depends on who you're reading. But they supposedly came down from Canada, from much farther north. And there are Athabascan speakers who speak up there. There's even some up in Northern California. So yeah, it's a complicated kind of interweaving of peoples across the Americas, many of these language stocks. Again, fascinating stuff. But again, I think what I would emphasize if somebody asks you about the languages is that we have people who speak languages which are similar to other people across North America, and that is part of this linguistic richness and linguistic diversity. Yeah?
Was there trade or commerce between these tribes?
Yeah, great. Yeah, again, a great question. Archaeologically, we've got great evidence of movements of goods. Some kinds of goods like obsidian. We've seen that beautiful, the volcanic glass that is found in different areas of California. It's very common in archaeological. It's common in the shell mounds. Because it can be geochemically sourced, because each of these, in terms of the obsidian flows are unique, we can do a geochemical signature of it, which means pretty much any obsidian we find, we can tell where it's from. And looking at the obsidian, just gives you an idea of it here in the Bay Area. When you look at the shell mounds and the obsidian in the shell mounds, it comes from up there in Santa Rosa, the Annandale. You guys been up to Annandale State Park? It has a huge obsidian flow. Mendocino, the Clear Lake area, has, again, the lake, sort of Lake County, has a huge flow. And Napa Valley, great wine, great up. This is the best obsidian around. It's beautiful stuff. I mean, it must produce good wine, I don't know, but obsidian. And what we also find, though, is from the Sierra Nevadas. There's obsidian coming down from the Sierra Nevadas. So it's either people going out there themselves, but what most of us think is because we've got such a dense population, it's trade. And that's just one example. There's shell that's found from the Pacific coast. There's abalone. Abalone is just one of the most beautiful materials to work. Roberta and where's Roberta, my lovely bride? Oh, there we've worked in the Southwest before we came out here to California, but we find obsidian out in the Southwest, in New Mexico, in Arizona. And again, that stuff wasn't flying out there. It was being traded. So yes, lots of trade. And then when you look at the ethnohistorical, the Spanish and the Russian accounts, the Mexican accounts, they talk a lot about the movement of goods and things. Really, again, a very rich literature on that. Yeah.
The shell mounds, are they local specificity, or do you find them all over the coast?
They tend to be, there are some mounded sites down in Southern California, but nothing in Southern California is as good or as interesting as the San Francisco Bay Area. I think everyone knows that. I mean, it's poor imitations, So there are some mounded places, but there's nothing like what we have here in the San Francisco Bay, where we have these very large mounded entities that have thousands of people buried in them, and all this other archaeology built into them. But where you do find similar kinds of sites is in the southeast and the midwestern part of the country. They have shell mounds. And in some of these, they are coastal shell mounds, and others are along streams. And they have freshwater shell that they harvested by thousands and thousands. So there's similar kinds of sites out there, but not so much in other parts of the West Coast, although you do sometimes get mounted areas. But the real interesting comparison is actually back out east. Yeah.
Do you have any idea about the life expectancy of Costanoans and Ohlones, and especially around the Bay Area, anywhere in California?
You know, in terms of pre-contact,
Yeah, pre-contact.
I mean, it certainly varied. I mean, I don't have like some numbers right offhand, but you know, you do find when you look at cemeteries and they analyze cemeteries, there tend to be a lot of kids. You know, the mortality of children was fairly high. But once you got through the childhood years, you know, middle-aged men and women were not uncommon, and occasionally.
By our point of view?
Yeah, I mean, but you even get some men or women that are in there, you know, God forbid, I mean, they're really young, I think, but, you know, in their 50s and 60s, and, you know, you do have an older generation. It is certainly not all, of course, we're able to live that old, but they do have a pretty long life. Those that were able to make it through those early years, I think you know, they were able to live pretty well. I don't know if Eric or anybody else has any actual, you know, average age and all that. There's been demographic work that's been done looking at cemeteries. And, you know, if I looked it up, I could probably give you a little better answer on that. Yeah.
Now, I was just wondering if there's any evidence of migration from the southern part, Central America or even South America.
So they
came up through into California.
Came back up. You know, there might be. That's a good question. I haven't really seen or heard too much about Iberia, and there's a whole argument being made. You know, it's controversial, but an interesting one, where they're looking at the stone tools that were made in Paleolithic Spain, France, and they're comparing them to what they're finding, the earliest tools in the southeast. And there's a similarity, and there's some archaeologists who are arguing that there's a relationship there. I think, again, if somebody asks you about the movements of people to Americas, I think the key point to say right now is one, our theoretical perspectives are in flux, and two, it appears that there were multiple migrations. It wasn't just one migration. It looks like multiple migrations, and probably multiple ways that people were getting here. I think that's a safe way to answer that. Yeah?
In the pre-contact times, what kind of diseases did they get? I know they got terrible diseases after the white people came, but were there particular diseases that they?
You know, it's a great question, because usually when we think of diseases, we think of, you know, measles, smallpox, influenza. I mean, I know that there's a whole controversy about tuberculosis and whether it was here, whether there was syphilis in the Americas or not. There's controversy about that and trying to determine it. One of the issues in terms of looking at disease with pre-contact people is you're dealing with skeletal materials, and you know, it's difficult for some. I mean, again, these are, you know, these crowd diseases like influenza and smallpox, but typically they don't leave much, from what I understand, in terms of looking at the skeletal materials. So I'm not sure if we really have that great a handle on it, and I don't know if you guys are back in the back, if there's any, you know, in terms of the diseases they have. But I know that tuberculosis, syphilis, and some others that we tend to think of as old world diseases, that there's some evidence that they might have actually been here pre-contact, but controversial. Yeah.
If the shell mound is considered a burial spot, is there controversy if you start to search through it?
Oh yeah, ask our friends here at the Presidio. Yeah, when they did all that work down at Crissy Field, yes, the shell mounds today are looked at by almost all descendant communities of the San Francisco Bay Area as sacred sites, and as sacred sites they have special meaning, and they are burial sites, and they have to be handled in a very, very sensitive way. I don't know if Eric wants to talk about dealing with Crissy Field or any of that, but you know, you work closely with the tribal group, and it depends on what needs to be done. What is difficult to do nowadays is, as a researcher, say at UC Berkeley, for me just to say, oh, I want to go work at this site. I showed you all those slides that UC Berkeley did, you know, at the beginning of the 1900s. There's no way we could do that work today. I mean, it would take a lot of work with a tribal group and some collaboration that would really allow us to do work. But the main thing that they're concerned with is the excavation of burials. Burials tend to be what's really, I think, a red flag, with good reason, with most tribal groups. And so wherever you're dealing with a cemetery situation, it's a special kind of site. So the shell mounds are looked at as being very special. Yeah, good point. Anything else? Man, you guys are good here.
Just thinking, like, really fast, the land management stuff that
Yeah.
you're talking about fascinates me. If you could look at, what I'm trying to get at is, did they change the landscape? What is the ecosystem that over 1,000 years, was it different if you could come and look at it here, and then 2,000 years later it's going to look different?
There are a number of arguments about this that have been basically, are out in the literature. But there are some ecologists, anthropologists, Kat Anderson, for example, who's done a lot of the work and has published on this. She argues that when the Spanish came into California in 1769 and 1770, that basically they were looking at a landscape that had been essentially domesticated. It was an anthropogenic landscape that had been created over centuries. And that a lot of the grasslands that they talk about when they were coming north in the Portola expedition, and the oak woodlands and a lot of these clear areas they were able to ride horses and everything, that was a created landscape and it had been created over time. What we're trying to do archaeologically is trying to figure out, all right, how, when did all that begin, and were there other kinds of landscapes, other kinds of ecosystems that they may have actually tended in earlier years? Was there change? We don't have a good understanding of that at all right now. We do know they used fire. We know that they basically implemented a lot of these landscape management practices, but we don't have a good diachronic. We don't have a good handle on when it first started, and how it changed over time, how the resources that were being used might have changed. And all that, I think, is the future of archaeology and paleoecology here in California. So that's something I think over time we'll probably have a better handle on. Right now, we don't have a great handle on that.
So the corollary to that then would be, if Portola went down and had all these grasslands, the fact that, we pretty much stopped that.
Yeah.
Have we changed the landscape?
Yes. Oh, God.
I'm not just talking
Yeah.
about physically changing the landscape with human things, but because we stopped the burning,
Yes.
have we grown forests where there weren't
Yes.
forests?
Very, very definitely. And I think you can begin by looking at the Spanish accounts and some of the early mapping that was done. And you can look at even some of the early mapping that was done by the United States government, and you can really see that with this, once they stopped burning, it took a while because you did have a grazing economy here. You did have the ranchos, and the ranchos liked grasslands, and they did burn. And you get some ranchers, even in the 1930s and 40s, who used to burn. For example, around Pinnacles, there were a number of them who burned chaparral to increase the grazing area. So there was burning that was done, but basically with the United States Forest Service and with the Department of Forestry and state of California, by about the 1900s, they implemented a fire suppression, Smokey the Bear, all that. That's when you really start seeing major changes. And areas that you can hardly walk today in some parks because it's just overgrown, used to actually be, if you go back and look at earlier sources, they used to be open areas. Where we were working in Ano Nuevo, it was agricultural fields in the 1940s and 50s, open area. When we were working there, just within the last couple of years, you couldn't even walk through it. It was so dense. And that scrubland and woodlands, that whole transformation has taken place just, within the last, 40, 50 years. And that's something that's happened all over California. And as a consequence of that, many of our managers of wild lands, United States Forest Service, the National Park Service, California State Parks, want to actually do something to increase biodiversity and to increase, in some ways, the health of a lot of these wild lands. And one of the things that they're looking at, and we're working with the tribes, is whether some of these management practices once used by the tribes could be reintroduced today. And that's a big issue. So when we're working with the National Park Service at Pinnacles National Park, that's a big issue that they have. When we're working with the California State Parks at Ano Nuevo, and then back up with the National Park Service in Point Reyes, that's an issue that they have, and that's also an issue the tribes have. So the Alma-Mutsun, who we're working with in the Ohlone group, we would be working with the Coast Miwok, the Great Rancheria up there in Point Reyes, if we can get that project rolling here. They have a real interest in basically reintroducing some of their traditional landscape management practices, so they can increase biodiversity, so they can get access to various plant remains that they can use for weaving baskets, for food, for dance regalia, because quite frankly, when we look archaeologically at Ano Nuevo, and we look at what was there back around 80,000, 1,300, 1,400, and we look at what's there today, some of the plants that they were using aren't even there, like hazelnut. We think hazelnut was being probably managed in Ano Nuevo. We've gone back down looking for hazelnut, and there's only just a few isolated hazelnut plants in the whole area. So there's been drastic changes that have gone on, and not necessarily for the better. So this is all the research that we're involved with. It's all part of kind of a broader scheme of kind of maybe rethinking a little bit about how we manage our public lands today. Whether some of this can be implemented or not, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of issues. But the research is we're trying to generate an idea at least about, well, what kind of plants and animals were there? How did it change over time? What management practices were being used? And then, can that have any hope or, any potential for what might be used today? Well, that's part of what we're doing. And in terms of these collaborative projects with the tribes and with these land management the state parks, national parks. So, yeah.
One more question. Well, wouldn't those land management practices have some kind of, maybe even great effect on the animals that live in the area, the native species? I mean, if you alter their habitat,
Sure.
ecosystems, then what happens to the animals?
They change. I mean, it's interesting when you look at particular species tend to live well in fire-prone areas. For example, rabbits and deer do really, really well. There's certain kinds of gophers, voles that don't do so well. So there would be a change. If we came in and started implementing some of this, we would change what exists today. And it would be essentially an issue with the tribe and with the landscape management people about whether it would actually be something that they would want to do, or whether it would have a detrimental effect. But yeah, anything you do, if we come back and start doing burning, for example, again, it's going to have an effect. It's going to change things in terms of what is there today. And those are all the kinds of political issues, the ethical issues that have to be thought through. So, yeah, great question.